Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today we're going to be looking at editing up the meeting DRAC page. So you can see we're just selecting the sections to edit and just inserting a new text block here, and we're starting to fill it in. And this is something I'm quite pleased to announce. I am hosting my first naval history conference with a working title of The Lessons of the Past Inform the Present and Future, and it's going to be held on HMS Belfast on the 17th of January 2026, as you can see. There will be quite a number of speakers and topics. The first one to reveal is, of course, what I will be talking about, which is how cheap and cheerful ships rarely are either of those things. But there will be a number of other features aboard HMS Belfast. There'll be soft drinks, hot drinks, and snacks provided. There's an on-site canteen if you want more substantial food. And of course, you get to be aboard HMS Belfast as well. Tickets will go on sale at some point in the near future. And of course, I will be expanding this list to include the other speakers and what they're talking about. But as you can see with Squarespace, it's very, very easy. I've just put the text box in. I can fill in everything I need. Nice and simple, and then once I'm done, I just save and exit, and my website is updated, just as easy as that. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So just before we start, I'd like to point out that there are less than half a dozen pictures of HMS Porcupine in her various forms that can reliably said to be her. Now, the funny thing is there's actually a folder I know of in the National Archives that has at least a dozen photos of her, which would, double, well, technically triple the amount of accessible photos in the easily accessible public domain of the ship, but that folder is scheduled for my next archival visit, so for the minute you'll have to put up with some photos of Porcupine, but also I'll be leveling it out with some photos of some of her sister ships and so forth, and hopefully you'll see why. Nonetheless, with the outbreak of World War II, the Royal Navy had recognised that it was critically short of escorts. They'd recognised that sometime before, but the start of World War II really brought it home. Although a great many small warships were already on the stocks, it was a simple fact that no one had really anticipated war coming this early. The Royal Navy's fleet destroyer of choice, the L and M class, was at this point a near 2,000-ton standard displacement hull with 6 guns in 3 twin mounts and a pair of quadruple torpedo launchers as the main armament. Now, although there was some argument ongoing as to the balance of anti-surface versus anti-aircraft firepower in destroyers in the Royal Navy, the single largest issue facing them with the outbreak of war was simply that these ships were fairly large and complex and therefore took more time and money to build compared to earlier destroyers. And that in turn meant that they would come into service more slowly, and their size and complexity pushed the capabilities of some shipyards that had previously built destroyers for the Royal Navy. In World War I, there had been a successful program of what were called war emergency destroyers, and it was decided to repeat the exercise in principle, but to help speed up the process, the somewhat smaller hull of the earlier J-class destroyers at just under 1,700 tons standard displacement was chosen as the basis, with slight modifications to the hull form, and loaded much more simply, reverting to the early and mid-interwar Royal Navy destroyer standard armament of 4 single 4.7-inch guns and a pair of quadruple torpedo launchers. This format would bring the average time from keel laying to commissioning down by around 6 months to about 18 months or so, which was on a par with the average keel to commission time for Fletcher-class destroyers. And it would allow limited resources to be spread more widely, since the 12 guns that would be needed to arm 2 of the L or M class would be able to equip 3 ships of the new O class. The armament, more typically associated with earlier destroyers in the 13 to 1400 ton range, would also, again in theory, allow for a much greater weight of anti-aircraft and anti-submarine weapons to be carried, plus, of course, the new sensors like radar and various other systems that were becoming available. However, that argument about anti-aircraft armament was still ongoing. Some of the O-class were changed mid-construction to replace one of the torpedo launchers with a 4-inch anti-aircraft gun for better anti-air protection, and then it was decided, well, just swap out all the 4.7-inch armament for 4-inch guns, and thus the P-class would launch, at least mostly, with 5 single 4-inch guns, which had a much better elevation than the 4.7-inch, and they'd have a single quadruple torpedo launcher. Although, thanks to all this coming about mid-construction, and then when the orders changed again later on to delete the amidships 4-inch gun and reinstate the second torpedo launcher, you can find photos of both O and P-class destroyers with variations of either 4 or 5 guns, and thus 1 or 2 torpedo launchers, which can get a bit confusing. Nonetheless, the last 3 P-class to be laid down were HMS Penn, Petard, and Porcupine, all of which were laid down on the 26th of December 1939, and the ship that we're looking at, Porcupine, launched in June 1941 and was commissioned at the end of August 1942. After some quick sea trials, she was dispatched to Scapa Flow to finish working up with the home fleet, but a number of the new P-class ships were quickly earmarked for work with Force H at Gibraltar in anticipation of Operation Torch. And so she was reassigned to the 3rd Destroyer Flotilla, along with 4 of her classmates, Panther, Partridge, Pathfinder, and Penn. And since she was going that way anyway, she was attached as an escort for various convoys heading to the Eastern Mediterranean in preparation for the aforementioned Torch landings. November 1942 saw the invasion of Vichy French North Africa, of course, and Porcupine was part of the action, but not directly in the landings themselves. Instead, she was part of a force that was escorting 3 British capital ships, 1 battlecruiser and 2 battleships, and 3 aircraft carriers, which were positioned to prevent any interference by either the Regia Marina or Marine Nationale ships from Toulon during the landings. Since neither the Vichy nor the Italian forces ended up sailing, the blocking force was disbanded once control ashore had been secured, and for Porcupine it was back to convoy duty, something that the P-class was being favoured for since their 4-inch armament would make them quite capable among mid-war British destroyers in terms of taking on enemy aircraft, but that same relatively small caliber loadout plus the single set of torpedo launchers made them somewhat less ideal for frontline duties, but by using them in convoys, they could free up other destroyers for those frontline duties. And that brings us to December, specifically December the 8th, 1942, which found Porcupine part of a 5-ship escort force comprising the older destroyers Antelope and Boreas, the World War I veteran HMS Vanek, and the Polish destroyer Błyskawica. Their job was to escort the troop ships Otranto and Tegelberg, as well as the submarine depot ship Maidstone, from Gibraltar. First, they would visit the newly captured Oran, and then they would head onward to Algiers. Once they reached their first stop at Oran, Otranto broke off from the convoy to enter the harbour itself, along with the Boreas and Błyskawica, leaving the Antelope, Vanek, and Porcupine to escort the Tegelberg and the Maidstone. On the night of the 9th through 10th, a number of German U-boats were patrolling in the area, one of which was detected by high-frequency direction finding, and the small convoy thus altered course to avoid it. But either that U-boat managed to cut across their course, or more likely there was just more than one U-boat out there, because around midnight U-602, a Type 7, drew a bead on the Maidstone, which was having engine issues. U-602 then unloaded all 4 of its forward torpedo tubes, and in the night the lookout spotted the glowing wakes of the torpedoes, but far too late. 3 torpedoes, however, missed their target entirely, 2 passing ahead and 1 astern of the Maidstone. The final torpedo, though, might have also been heading to miss astern, or might just about have been on target, but we'll never know, and Maidstone's crew were quite grateful for that, because it turned out that Porcupine, sailing abreast Maidstone, was square in the weapon's path, and soon a towering column of water shot up amidships. with a hole larger than the front profile of most houses blown straight into the side of the ship abreast the engine room. The ship rapidly began to list to port, only for the damage to cause the portside engine to simply detach and fall clean through the hole, which somewhat compensated for the ingress of water, but now left the ship listing heavily to starboard instead. As the crew picked themselves up, they found the damage weirdly localized. After shoring up bulkheads to contain the flooding as best they could, emergency generators were started, and they found there were only 10 casualties, 7 killed and 3 wounded. They also found the forward torpedo launcher was missing, the explosion having presumably sent it overboard as some kind of herald for the portside engine. HMS Vanek then took the ship in tow and removed non-essential personnel while sending a transmission out describing the situation, although Porcupine's crew initially thought that the description of their ship as completely disabled and sinking was overblowing it a bit. But that opinion changed as dawn approached, and the ship continued to settle. Soon, Porcupine was gently moving along under tow, but she only had the damage control parties left aboard. Luckily for all concerned, one of those who saw Vanek's message was the then captain, and later Rear Admiral, Edward Ellsberg of the US Navy. He had spent his war merrily salvaging his way around Africa and the Mediterranean, to the immense frustration of various Axis commanders, since he seemed determined to single-handedly undo all the hard work that aforementioned Axis captains had done in sinking various ships. Ellsberg reckoned it would take about 10 hours for Porcupine to reach Oran at a rate of about 3 knots from the position that she was last reported at, but he also reckoned she probably wasn't going to last that long. So he quickly consulted a map and discovered there was a small harbour and port at Arzu, which would only need the crippled ship to travel about half the distance in order to reach it. Hastily, Ellsberg asked for the ship to be diverted there, then requested a motor torpedo boat be made ready at Arzu, and then took off in a jeep, heading first for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary King Salvor, a British salvage ship that he was working with to repair various battle-damaged vessels that were already in Oran. Borrowing one of the ship's engineers, he also had the ship start offloading various portable pumps, divers, and salvage equipment. These would be picked up by a truck that he ordered to follow when it was ready, before he then ordered his jeep's driver to make his best speed for Arzu. Having somehow managed an average speed of 60 miles an hour in a World War II-era jeep on the battered and winding roads between the two ports, Ellsberg and his newly acquired engineer, Jock Brown, found themselves on an MTB and heading out to sea about 30 minutes after they'd left the King Salvor. Back out at sea, the frigate HMS X had taken over the tow, with Vanek circling to provide anti-submarine escort, but as Porcupine's list increased, they'd started to throw overboard anything and everything that they could find and detach from the decks, except for the torpedoes in the aft launcher, which was jammed and couldn't be turned to discharge them. But it now was increasingly looking like it would be a losing battle, as the speed of the Porcupine had dropped from 5 knots initially under tow to just 1 knot over the course of the morning. Vanek, of course, was circling around, but was joined by a patrol aircraft, also taking up anti-submarine warfare duty, and just after 1300, Ellsberg's racing MTB arrived. By this point, Porcupine's stern was near enough level with the sea, and he reported that there was almost no freeboard remaining amidships on the starboard side either, with the ship having assumed a list of just over 20 degrees. The MTB had initially approached from the starboard side of the ship, expecting a vessel that had been hit on the port side to be listing to port. But thanks to that missing engine, the list had of course reversed itself, and so the MTB had to circle around behind the Porcupine to get to the other side. Ellsberg and Brown took a running jump off the MTB's deck and onto a scramble net that was hanging over the port side just forward of the massive hole in the hull, and quickly climbed aboard. Having established the basics of the situation with the ship's captain, Ellsberg then carefully headed aft across the oil-soaked decks, treated to the unnerving sight of what was left of the ship's structure around the torpedo hole, flexing up and down with the waves almost independent of the fore and aft sections of the ship. Joined by Brown and Porcupine's chief engineer, Bartley, Ellsberg descended into the steadily flooding compartments below, trying to puzzle out how water was bypassing the shored-up bulkheads. Eventually, Brown spotted a slight upwelling in two places. These turned out to be access trunks leading down to the prop shaft alleys, and although they were dogged shut, some immense pressure was forcing water up and through them. Brown found a hammer and dived into the oil-covered water to hammer the starboard dogs as tight as they'd go. Bartley then took the hammer and repeated the exercise on the port side hatch, which was in slightly shallower water, but it was to no avail. Although the dogs were hammered to as shut as they were ever going to get, the hatches were simply made of too light a metal to withstand the pressure they were under, and both men reported that they had felt that they had bulged upwards. So no matter how tight the dogs were, the distortion of the hatch itself meant they simply wouldn't seal properly. Ellsberg decided that he was going to try two separate measures. He sent the oil-covered Brown topside to find the ship's carpenter, with the idea of rigging up shoring beams which might, if cut to the right length and then hammered into place against the hatches and the ceiling, wedge the thin hatch covers back into place, partly by just distorting them the other way. In the meantime, he and Bartley hunted down a portable pump, finding a small hand-powered one, which was just in the process of being reassembled after it had choked on debris earlier that morning. But the small pump couldn't even keep ahead of the incoming flow, so they went forward to retrieve a more powerful electric-powered pump from the forward boiler rooms, where it was quite happily keeping up with the relatively minor leaks present there. Judging that the leaks in the boiler room were relatively trivial compared to the amount of water that was coming into the aft section, Ellsberg and Bartley organised a work party to bring up the pump and its cabling, moving it aft and then starting it up again, pumping out the stern. In the meantime, Brown managed to get the shoring beams organised, and between both measures, the flooding was largely arrested, although, weirdly enough, the water levels weren't reducing. This puzzled all concerned, as the capacity of the electric pump was far more than the relatively small amount of leakage that was left coming up from the propeller shafts. It then turned out that an air port in one of the staterooms had been known to be somewhat leak-prone before the ship was hit, and now, well submerged and covered in debris and oil, it must be contributing the rest of the incoming water. Whilst this wasn't ideal, and there was no way to access the leaking airport, at least the ship wasn't taking on any more water, which meant that, slow as she was, she should still be able to make it into port barring outside interference. Next was a somewhat gambled decision. With the situation aft stabilised, Ellsberg and Captain Stewart had to now evaluate the ship's durability. They were currently travelling at 3 knots, but they eventually concluded that the broken amidships plating was working too much in the sea, and they had to ask the X to slow down to 2 knots. It would mean more time at sea, and potentially more risk of a U-boat coming back to finish them off, but the alternative was to keep going at their current speeds, and the forces the ship was experiencing meant that they might risk complete structural failure. Come nightfall, and some brave sailor managed to work out a safe and dry route down to the rum store, and the ship's crew were all fortified with a much-delayed double rum ration. At long last, the ship entered the shadow of Cape Carbon, and the seas calmed enough to let them get up to 3 knots again, although Ellsberg notes in his report that the X seemed to interpret this 3-knot speed limit somewhat liberally. Eventually, the procession stopped about a mile out from Arzu, and the tow was handed over to a small tug or trawler, depending on who you ask, from the port, which took them on a much shorter line, which was then suitable for entering the narrow harbour. For a while, though, they were immobilised as a rusted-shut shackle on the anchor line that had been used to tow the ship thus far was holding up proceedings, as they were trying to jettison the line. Eventually, this was dealt with by just sawing through the line that the shackle was attached to, and thus dropping the anchor cable and allowing the ship to move on. Porcupine was now carefully moved alongside the main quay, where the various pumps and other equipment that Ellsberg had ordered from the King Salvor awaited them. Over the rest of the night, the ship was pumped out by the salvage crew, while the ship's actual crew in Ellsberg took a well-earned nap, and what was left of the ship was shored up. By dawn, she was upright and in proper trim again, and pretty much dry, with the exception, of course, of the breached engine room. Ellsberg then headed back to Oran, where soon thereafter Porcupine appeared. Having been somewhat further shored up, she was towed to the larger port in hopes of repairing her. Initially, it was thought that they might be able to weld steel girders over the hole in the port side to strengthen the ship enough for it to be towed back to the UK and then refitted for further service. But once she was brought out of the water on a floating dry dock that itself had been salvaged earlier after Vichy attempts to scuttle it, it was clear that there was barely anything left of the amidships apart from the upper deck to work with. Ellsberg wondered, on seeing her out of the water, how she'd even managed to hold together in the first place. And so instead, it was decided that they would finish what the torpedo had started, cutting the ship fully in half, removing the remaining tangled amidship structure, then sealing up the two halves and towing them home separately. The plan at that point was then to build an entire new amidship section and then weld the ship back together. But by summer 1943, with both halves of the ship back in the UK, they concluded that it would just be faster to build more destroyers, and so the two halves were instead converted for use as accommodation hulks in Portsmouth, becoming known as HMS Pork and HMS Pine for the bow and stern respectively. Here they would see out the war, first in use as general accommodation ships, then specifically attached to the minesweeping department, and then the general admin section. But they were paid off and sold for scrapping in summer 1946, becoming one in a weirdly long line of Royal Navy ships that were either broken in two or otherwise reduced to substantially less ship than they previously had been, before then somehow continuing on in some kind of active service.